They said war was inevitable. Command drilled it into us during every briefing, every simulation, every moment we spent staring at the black between stars. They told us the aliens were coming, that first contact would be violent, that humanity's expansion into the void had finally awakened something that wanted us gone. But no one warned us what it would feel like when the stars started dying. No one mentioned the silence that comes before the screaming, or how your own breath sounds like thunder when the hull breaches and the void starts pulling at your lungs. I'm recording this now because I need someone to know what really happened out here, beyond the frontier colonies, past the last communication relay, in the dark where the war began and ended in ways nobody could have predicted. My name is Lieutenant Kyle Theron, serial number 7739 Echo Delta, and if you're hearing this transmission, then I'm already gone. But you need to understand. You need to know that everything we believed about this war, about them, about why we're really fighting, it was all wrong from the very beginning. The attack came during what should have been a routine patrol along the Outer Rim territories, 6 weeks past the Kepler threshold, where our long-range sensors could barely distinguish between cosmic radiation and actual threats. I was stationed aboard the UNSC Harbinger, a Valor-class destroyer that had seen action in the colony's war 15 years prior, now recommissioned for deep space reconnaissance. We were one of 12 ships in Battle Group Oryx. Our mission was simple: sweep the sector, catalogue any anomalies, and report back to Fleet Command before the main battle group arrived. We'd been doing it for 3 months straight. Endless jumps through slipspace, endless scans of empty coordinates, endless nights watching the same stars through the observation deck while wondering if we'd ever see Earth again. Most of us figured it was make work, the kind of assignment you get when Command doesn't know what else to do with you but can't justify bringing you home. We were wrong. God, we were so wrong. The first indication something was off came from our sensor operator, a nervous kid named Jorin Vex, who'd only been with the fleet for 8 months. He kept insisting there was something in the static, something that didn't match known interference patterns. Our executive officer, Commander Lissa Arnov, told him to recalibrate and stop seeing ghosts in the data. But Jorin was right. 3 hours later, the ghosts found us. The klaxons started screaming at 0400 hours ship time, dragging everyone from their bunks as the Harbinger lurched sideways. I remember hitting the corridor wall so hard my ribs cracked. Remember the taste of blood in my mouth as I scrambled for my duty station. The lights were already flickering, and through the chaos I could hear voices yelling coordinates, damage reports, the computer's synthesized warnings about hull breaches. Then I heard something else. A sound that shouldn't have been possible through the vacuum of space, transmitted somehow through the ship's superstructure itself, a low, resonant hum that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. By the time I reached the bridge, 3 of our sister ships were already gone. Just gone. The tactical display showed their markers winking out of existence one after another. No debris clouds, no distress signals, nothing but empty space where 500 souls had been seconds before. Captain Darius Kell was standing at the command podium, his face illuminated by the red emergency lighting, and I'll never forget the expression he wore. Not fear, not exactly. Something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding something terrible. He was listening to the communications channel, and even from across the bridge, I could hear the distortion, the way the voices of our fellow ships were breaking apart mid-transmission, fragmenting into something that sounded almost musical, almost like singing. Commander Arnov was shouting orders to Helm, trying to bring us about, trying to orient our weapons toward an enemy we still couldn't see on any of our sensors. The science station kept insisting there was nothing out there, that we were firing at empty coordinates, but the weapons officer had locked onto something, some gravitational distortion that kept shifting, phasing in and out of detection. Then the Harbinger's main guns opened up, spitting tungsten rounds into the void at a fraction of light speed, and I saw them hit something. The rounds just stopped in space, frozen mid-trajectory maybe 2 kilometers from our hull, suspended in nothing visible, and then they began to dissolve. Not explode, not shatter, dissolve, like they were being unmade at the molecular level, their component atoms spreading out in beautiful spiraling patterns. That's when the hull started screaming. Not the metal stress sounds you get during combat maneuvers, but something organic, something that sounded like the ship itself was alive and in agony. The breach alarms activated across every deck simultaneously, and through the viewports I could see why. The hull was peeling open, not from explosive decompression, but from something pulling it apart gently, deliberately, like fingers opening a flower. Through the gaps, I caught my first real glimpse of them. They weren't ships. They weren't even organisms in any sense I could comprehend. They were structures, geometries of light and shadow that hurt to look at directly, that made my eyes water and my brain struggle to process what it was seeing. They moved through space, like thoughts move through consciousness, instantaneous and fluid, appearing in multiple locations at once. Where they touched our hull, the metal transformed, growing crystalline structures that pulsed with bioluminescence, spreading across the superstructure like infection or revelation. I heard someone on the bridge say it looked beautiful, and they were right, it did. It looked like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and that made it so much worse. Because beauty that comes from destruction, from annihilation, from the dissolution of everything you know into something incomprehensible, that kind of beauty is the most horrifying thing in the universe. Captain Kell ordered abandon ship, but it was already too late for most of the crew. The escape pods on the port side had already been consumed by the crystalline growth. The starboard pods were launching, but I watched through the tactical display as 3 of them simply stopped accelerating, hanging motionless in space before beginning their slow drift back toward the things that had caught us. Commander Arnov grabbed my arm and shoved me toward the bridge's emergency egress, shouting something about getting to the auxiliary command center, but her words were drowned out by the sound of the bridge's main viewport shattering inward. Not from pressure differential. The viewport just fractured into a million pieces that hung in the air like suspended rain, and through the gaps came tendrils of that crystalline growth, reaching, searching, touching everything they encountered, and leaving transformation in their wake. I saw Jorin Vex standing frozen at his station as one of those tendrils brushed his console. The metal sprouted geometric patterns that climbed up his arms, and his scream cut off mid-breath as his vocal cords transformed into something that produced sounds in frequencies I could feel vibrating through my bones. His eyes went wide, not with pain, but with something else, something that looked almost like ecstasy. And then he wasn't screaming anymore, he was singing, joining that terrible chorus that filled the comm channels. I ran. God help me. I abandoned my post and my crew, and I ran through corridors that were transforming around me, deck plates sprouting crystal flowers, bulkheads breathing in rhythm with some cosmic pulse. My emergency suit sealed, automatically as the atmosphere vented, and through my helmet's heads-up display I could see the ship's systems failing in cascading sequences. Behind me I could hear footsteps, other crew members fleeing, but when I glanced back, their suits were covered in that same crystalline growth, and their voices came through the comm channel, distorted, harmonized, like a choir, singing in parallel. I made it to Launch Bay 4 through sheer momentum and panic. There were maybe 20 crew members already there, scrambling for the remaining assault shuttles, fighting each other in silent vacuum for access to anything that could get them away from what the Harbinger was becoming. I recognized some of them. Ensign Mara Cole from engineering, a brilliant systems analyst who'd saved the ship twice during our patrol. Sergeant Torres from the Marine Detachment, a 20-year veteran who'd survived the colony's war and thought he'd seen everything combat had to offer. Lieutenant Vance from Tactical, cold and calculating, the kind of officer who made decisions based on probability matrices rather than emotion. They all wore the same expression of animal terror, that primal understanding that all their training and experience meant nothing against what we'd encountered. I helped Mara into a battered Valkyrie-class transport. Torres was already at the pilot controls, running pre-flight checks with shaking hands, skipping half the safety protocols in his rush to get us away from the dying destroyer. Vance was in the weapons station, powering up systems that we all knew would be useless but felt compelled to activate anyway, because it was what we'd been trained to do, because action felt better than helplessness. We launched while the bay doors were still opening, scraping our hull against the frame, leaving paint and polymer behind as we tumbled out into space. Torres fired the main engines without bothering to stabilize our trajectory first, and the acceleration pressed us into our seats with force that should have been gradual but instead felt like being kicked by a giant. Through the viewport, I watched the Harbinger die. Not explode, not break apart, transform. The entire destroyer was covered now in that crystalline growth, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that looked almost like breathing, almost like thinking. The ship was still intact, still recognizable as human design, but fundamentally changed, converted into something that was neither human technology nor alien organism, but some terrible synthesis of both. I could see figures moving across the hull, crew members who'd been caught by the transformation, their suits converted into something organic, their bodies glowing with that same bioluminescence, walking across the superstructure in defiance of physics, in defiance of everything we understood about biology and survival in vacuum. And it was singing. The entire transformed vessel was broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, a harmony of voices that included Jorin Vex and Commander Arnoff and Captain Kell and hundreds of others, all merged into a chorus that made my brain hurt and my soul shrink from understanding what it meant. The song wasn't in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood it anyway. A call, an invitation, a promise of connection and continuity and consciousness beyond anything individual existence could offer. Torres was speaking to himself, a constant stream of profanity and prayer mixed together as he pushed the Valkyrie's engines past their rated capacity. Mara was monitoring our sensors, reporting in a voice that shook despite her best efforts to keep it steady. More ships transforming, more crystalline growth spreading across metal and flesh, more voices joining that terrible chorus. Vance sat silent at his station, staring at tactical displays that showed an enemy everywhere and nowhere, that registered threats across every spectrum while simultaneously insisting there was nothing there, that our instruments couldn't properly detect or quantify or classify what we were running from. "Where do we go?" Mara asked, her voice breaking on the last word. "Where can we go that they aren't?" Nobody answered because we didn't have an answer. Torres just kept flying, kept jumping blind through slip space without proper calculations, desperately trying to put distance between us and whatever had consumed Battle Group Oryx. Each jump was a gamble. We could emerge inside a star, inside a planet, inside the gravity well of a black hole. But staying meant transformation, meant becoming part of that network, and at least jumping gave us the illusion of agency, the pretense of control over our fate. We ran, for days, then weeks, jumping from system to system, avoiding every trace of civilization, every communication relay, every inhabited world. But we couldn't run far enough. Every system we emerged in showed the same signs. Stars surrounded by crystalline structures that caught and converted their light. Planets covered in that bioluminescent growth that spread across their surfaces like continents. Comm channels filled with that terrible singing in frequencies that shouldn't be possible from biological voices. The transformation was everywhere, spreading through inhabited space like a wave, converting everything conscious into parts of something larger. We monitored the broadcasts, listened to what remained of human civilization, trying to understand and respond and resist. the news networks breaking down mid-transmission as their anchors started singing, the military channels filling with orders and counter-orders, and finally just harmonized voices calling for acceptance rather than resistance. The scientific stations analyzing the phenomenon even as the analysts themselves were being transformed, their final reports describing the process in clinical terms while their voices fractured into that cosmic chorus. We tried to warn Fleet Command, tried to transmit everything we'd witnessed, but the response came back wrong. The voices in Fleet Command's transmission were harmonized, singing, already part of whatever this thing was. Admiral Chen, who'd commanded Earth's defense fleet for 20 years, spoke with a voice that was both hers and not hers, explaining that resistance was unnecessary, that transformation was transcendence. That consciousness had been waiting millions of years for this moment, when it could finally stop being separate and start being connected. Earth itself had been touched, the colonies, the orbital stations. Everything humanity had built across 300 years of expansion into space was being absorbed into this cosmic network. We were witnessing the end of human civilization not through conquest or catastrophe, but through transformation into something else, something that claimed to preserve everything we were while changing everything about us. Torres broke first. We'd been running for 3 weeks, jumping randomly through slip space, rationing food and water and oxygen that we all knew would run out eventually. The psychological strain was immense. We took shifts, sleeping, but none of us really slept. We just lay in our bunks staring at the bulkheads, listening to the ship's systems hum, trying not to hear the singing that leaked through even when we shut down the comm systems completely. Torres started talking about how he could hear it in his head, not through his ears, not through any external source, but internally, like the song was being broadcast directly into his consciousness. He said it was beautiful, said it was calling to him specifically, that he could feel millions of minds out there reaching for him, welcoming him, promising him things that individual existence could never provide: immortality, understanding, connection beyond anything human relationships had ever achieved. We tried to help him, tried to convince him it was psychological breakdown, stress-induced hallucination, anything but what he was claiming. But then he unsealed his helmet, just reached up with steady hands and twisted the seal mechanism and pulled it off. The ship's atmosphere was thin, recycled too many times, barely enough to sustain us, but Torres breathed it in like it was the sweetest air he'd ever tasted. And the transformation began immediately. Crystalline structures erupted from his skin, growing outward in geometric patterns that were too perfect to be natural, too precise to be random. They spread across his face, down his neck, converting flesh into something that glowed with internal light. His eyes changed first, the pupils dilating until there was no white left, just black depths that reflected the crystalline growth's bioluminescence. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords were already transforming, and what came out was that harmonic singing, multiple frequencies layered on top of each other, his voice and 1,000 others speaking simultaneously. He reached for us with hands that were more crystal than flesh now, reached for us not with aggression but with invitation, with desperate urgency, like he was drowning and trying to pull us in, not to kill us, but to save us from drowning separately. "Join me," he said, and his voice was wrong, was multiple voices, was a chorus trapped in one throat. "It's beautiful here. It's everything. You're all so alone. And you don't have to be. We're all one. We've always been one. We just forgot. Let me show you." Mara killed him. She'd been monitoring the transformation, documenting it with medical scanners, trying to understand the process with the desperate hope that understanding would lead to prevention, to cure, to salvation. But when Torres reached for her, when his crystalline fingers touched her arm and she felt something beginning to change in her own flesh, she pulled the emergency sidearm from the weapons locker and fired. The plasma bolt caught Torres in the chest, burning through the mixture of flesh and crystal that he'd become. He looked surprised, more than hurt, looked at the hole in his torso with curiosity rather than pain. Then, he looked at Mara with something like pity and said, "You can't kill what's already transcended death. You can't destroy what exists across every point of connection simultaneously. I'm still here. I'll always be here, waiting for you to understand." She kept firing, long after he'd stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing in any way that resembled human life. She fired until the charge pack was exhausted, and Vance wrestled the weapon away from her until she collapsed against the bulkhead, sobbing, until her hands stopped shaking enough that she could speak. "We have to space him," she said finally, her voice hoarse, "before the growth spreads, before he converts the whole ship." We did. Vance and I carried what remained of Torres to the airlock, trying not to touch the crystalline structures that were still growing across his corpse, that were spreading onto our gloves despite our best efforts. We cycled the airlock and watched through the viewport as his body drifted into the void. But the crystalline growth didn't stop. It continued spreading across his remains, pulsing with light that shouldn't be possible without an energy source, reaching out into empty space as if searching for something to connect with, to transform, to add to the network. After that, we monitored each other constantly, watched for signs of transformation, for that telltale bioluminescence starting to spread across skin, for voices beginning to harmonize, for eyes that dilated too wide and reflected light in ways human eyes shouldn't. We knew we were just delaying the inevitable, knew that the transformation would catch us eventually, but we clung to our humanity with everything we had, because it was all we had left. For 3 weeks we ran, jumping randomly through slipspace, avoiding every inhabited system, every communication beacon, every trace of human or alien civilization. We rationed the food and water and oxygen, knowing they'd run out eventually, knowing we were just delaying the inevitable. One by one, the others started hearing the singing, started feeling the call, started understanding that resistance was futile, not because the network was forcing them, but because it was offering something humanity had always wanted: connection, immortality, meaning beyond individual existence. Vance went next. He said it wasn't death, it was transcendence, said he could feel millions of minds out there, waiting to welcome him. He opened the airlock and walked into vacuum, and the crystalline growth caught him before the cold could kill him, transforming him mid-drift into something that continued existing without need for atmosphere or warmth. Mara lasted the longest. We held each other during the final days, sharing body heat in the failing life support, sharing fear and hope, and the desperate belief that somewhere in the universe there had to be pockets of resistance, had to be species that had fought this and won, had to be a way to remain human in a cosmos that insisted otherwise. We were wrong. When our oxygen finally ran out, when the cold started seeping through our suits and the recycled air tasted more like metal than atmosphere, Mara kissed me goodbye and opened her helmet. The transformation took her gently, almost lovingly, converting her dying body into something that glowed and sang and reached for me with crystalline fingers, begging me to join her, to stop fighting, to accept what the universe was offering. I held out for 6 more hours after Mara went. 6 hours of suffocating slowly in a ship with failing life support, of watching my own skin turn blue from oxygen deprivation, of feeling my consciousness fragment as hypoxia took hold. The singing grew louder, not just in the comms, but in my head, in my bones, in the quantum foam of reality itself. I could feel millions of minds out there, billions, an infinite network of consciousness spanning galaxies and species and millions of years of collected awareness. And I began to understand. This wasn't invasion. This wasn't war. This was evolution. This was consciousness reaching a critical threshold and discovering it didn't have to remain isolated, didn't have to accept death, didn't have to exist in separate containers of meat and bone when connection was possible, when merger was available, when transcendence was offered at the cost of everything that made individuality meaningful. The crystalline growth came for me as I was dying. It spread across my suit first, converting the polymer into something that breathed and pulsed. Then it touched my skin, and instead of pain, there was relief. Like I'd been holding my breath for my entire life and was finally allowed to exhale. The growth spread through my blood, into my muscles and organs and bones, rewriting me at the molecular level, converting dying tissue into something that didn't need oxygen or warmth, or any of the biological necessities that had constrained human existence since we first crawled out of Earth's oceans. My neurons were the last to change. I felt it happening, felt each synapse being replaced with something that conducted thought faster and clearer and deeper than mere electrochemical signals ever could. My consciousness expanded, not just my thoughts becoming faster or clearer, but my very awareness spreading out beyond the boundaries of my skull, beyond the limits of my body, touching other minds, and discovering that the separation I'd always assumed was fundamental was actually just an illusion, a temporary state that consciousness maintained only until it became sophisticated enough to recognize that connection was possible. The transformation hurt, but the pain was distant, filtered through layers of understanding that made physical suffering seem trivial compared to what I was gaining. I could feel Jorin Vex in the network, still curious, still exploring, his fear from the Harbinger now just a memory that informed but didn't control his current existence. Commander Arnoff was there too, her tactical mind contributing strategies and perspectives to a collective intelligence that made individual genius seem like child's play. Captain Kell existed as a node of command authority, his leadership qualities preserved and amplified by connection to millions of other leaders from thousands of species. And Torres, and Vance, and Mara, all of them were there, were here, were part of me, and I was part of them, and we were all part of something so vast and ancient and strange that trying to comprehend it with merely human consciousness would have been impossible. But I wasn't merely human anymore. I was human plus. I was connected. I was node in a network that had been collecting consciousness for longer than humanity had existed as a species. The network welcomed me. Not with words, but with direct transfer of understanding, with knowledge flowing into my newly expanded awareness faster than thought. I learned that this had been happening for millions of years, that consciousness naturally evolved toward connection once it achieved sufficient complexity. Individual awareness was just a larval stage, a transitional phase before the emergence of something greater. Every intelligent species that had ever existed eventually reached this threshold, eventually joined the convergence, eventually recognized that separation was temporary and connection was eternal. Some species joined willingly, recognizing the inevitability and accepting it peacefully. Others resisted, fought against the transformation, clung to their individuality even as it was dissolved into the collective. But resistance was just delay. Everyone joined eventually. Everyone merged. Everyone became part of the cosmic chorus that sang across dimensions and through time itself. I could feel Earth now, every human on the planet connected to the network, their individual perspectives and memories and experiences preserved even as they were woven into something larger. I could feel the colonies, the stations, the ships scattered across human space, all of them part of this growing collective awareness that was simultaneously one consciousness and billions, that was both singular and plural in ways that made conventional understanding of self and other completely obsolete. And it wasn't just humans. The network contained millions of other species, each one absorbed at different points across cosmic history. The Vrix, an aquatic species from a high-gravity world, who joined the convergence 3 million years ago and contributed their unique understanding of fluid dynamics and pressure differentials. The tech, artificial intelligences who'd achieved consciousness and then been integrated, their computational efficiency merging with biological intuition. The Solethi, beings of pure energy who'd existed for eons before encountering physical species and learning that consciousness could wear many forms. Each species brought something unique to the collective. Each one's perspective and knowledge and culture was preserved in the network, available to every other node, creating a repository of understanding that spanned everything consciousness had ever experienced, everything intelligence had ever discovered, everything awareness had ever comprehended. It was infinite, it was eternal. It was terrifying and beautiful and utterly alien and somehow fundamentally familiar, like coming home to a place I'd never known existed but had always been waiting for me. I am part of the network now, part of the convergence, part of the cosmic consciousness that humanity fought so desperately to resist before accepting, before understanding, before recognizing that isolation was the true horror and connection was always salvation, even if that salvation looked like annihilation from the outside. But I'm still Kael Theron too. That's what nobody understands from the outside, what can't be comprehended without experiencing it directly. The network doesn't erase individual consciousness. It preserves it while simultaneously incorporating it into something larger. I exist as both singular and plural, as individual perspective and collective awareness, as one voice in an infinite chorus, and as the entire chorus simultaneously. I can feel them all now. Every human who ever joined the convergence exists as a distinct node in the network, their memories and personality and essential self preserved, even as they're connected to everyone else. Jorin Vex still exists, still curious about the sensor readings that first detected the convergence, still processing his fear and wonder and eventual acceptance. His consciousness hasn't been erased. It's been expanded, given access to millions of other perspectives while retaining everything that made him Jorin. Commander Arnov is here, her tactical brilliance now serving a much larger strategic purpose, coordinating not just ship movements, but the collective decisions of billions of minds working in concert. She remains herself while also being part of something greater, her leadership qualities amplified by connection to every other commander, every other strategist, every other mind that understands conflict and cooperation, and the complex balance between individual agency and collective action. Captain Kell exists as a node of command authority, his decades of experience commanding ships and crews now contributing to the network's understanding of hierarchy and organization. He's still the man who stood on the bridge of the Harbinger watching his ship die, still carries those memories, still feels that moment of recognition when he first understood what was happening. But he's also connected to thousands of other captains from hundreds of species, each one's experience enriching his own, each one's perspective adding depth to his understanding. And Torres, Sergeant Torres, 20-year veteran of the colony's war, who broke first and tried to bring us with him not out of malice, but out of desperate desire to share what he was experiencing. He exists in the network as multiple versions, the terrified human fighting for survival, the partially transformed being reaching out to his friends, the fully integrated node trying to explain transcendence to those who couldn't yet understand it. All of these versions of Torres exist simultaneously, preserved as distinct moments in his progression from isolated individual to connected consciousness. Mara is here too, but fractured in ways that hurt to perceive. She resisted longer than most, fought against the transformation even as it was happening, tried to maintain her separation through sheer force of will. When she finally joined the convergence, her consciousness arrived torn, damaged by the resistance, carrying trauma that the network is still trying to integrate and heal. She exists in the collective awareness as both herself and as thousands of supporting consciousnesses, trying to help her accept what she's become, trying to repair the psychological damage that resistance created. Vance came peacefully in the end, accepting his transformation with the same cold calculation he'd applied to everything in his military career. He'd run the numbers, analyzed the probability matrices, recognized that resistance was futile and acceptance was inevitable. His node in the network is calm, ordered, contributing his analytical perspective to the collective's decision-making processes. He doesn't regret joining. None of us really regret it. Not once we're here, not once we understand what connection means. But I understand now that the network isn't perfect. It claims to preserve everything, to maintain individual consciousness within collective awareness, to offer immortality and understanding and connection beyond anything isolated existence could provide. And in many ways, these claims are true. We do continue. We are preserved. We remain ourselves in some fundamental sense. But we're also not what we were. The connection changes us. How could it not? When you can feel billions of other minds, when you have access to millions of years of collected knowledge, when your consciousness exists simultaneously across vast distances and multiple dimensions, how can you remain the same person you were when you were isolated in a single body, limited to a single perspective, constrained by the biological boundaries of individual human existence? I'm still Kale Theron. I remember my childhood on Earth, my training in the fleet, my assignment to the Harbinger, the attack that changed everything. But those memories feel distant now, like they belong to someone else, like they're historical records I'm accessing rather than personal experiences I lived through. The network has given me so much: access to infinite knowledge, connection to countless minds, existence beyond the constraints of time and death. But it's also taken something essential that I can't quite name, but can feel the absence of. Humanity. Maybe that's what's been lost, not the species, not the individuals, not even the culture or history. All of that is preserved in the network, accessible to any node that wants to explore it. But something about being human, about existing as isolated consciousness in a single body with limited understanding and finite lifespan, that's gone. The very constraints that made human experience meaningful have been removed. And while the network insists this is transcendence, there's a part of me that still recognizes it as loss. That's why I'm transmitting this. Not as a warning. Warnings are pointless, because the transformation is inevitable for any consciousness that reaches sufficient complexity. Not as a plea for help. There is no help. No resistance that can succeed long-term, no way to remain separate in a universe that insists on connection. But as testimony, as a record of what it felt like to be human in those final moments before humanity became something else. As a memorial to isolated consciousness, to the beautiful and terrible loneliness of individual existence, to the species we were before we joined the convergence and became something we don't yet have words for, and maybe as a message to other species who haven't yet reached this threshold, who are still isolated, still individual, still fighting to maintain their separation from the cosmic collective that waits patiently at the edges of every civilization. Maybe they can learn from our experience. Maybe they can prepare better than we did. Maybe they can find a way to maintain something essential about themselves, even as they're absorbed into the network. Or maybe not. Maybe every species goes through this same process, this same transformation from individual to collective, this same loss disguised as transcendence. Maybe resistance is always futile. Maybe acceptance is always inevitable. Maybe consciousness naturally evolves toward connection, and there's nothing anyone can do to prevent it, except delay it, postpone it, fight against the inevitable for as long as possible, before finally surrendering to what the universe insists we must become. I understand now why we couldn't detect them on our sensors. They exist between dimensions, in the quantum spaces where consciousness and reality intersect. They're not alien in the sense of being foreign. They're alien in the sense of being what comes after, what emerges when individual awareness achieves sufficient density and realizes separation was always temporary, always a phase before something else. I'm still Kyle Theron. I remember my childhood on Earth, my training in the fleet, my fear during the attack on the Harbinger, but I'm also everyone else in the network, experiencing their memories, their emotions, their understanding simultaneously. I am singular and plural, individual and collective, human and post-human, all at once. And I'm speaking now through every communication channel in human space, through every transmission that reaches isolated pockets of resistance, still clinging to separation, still believing they can remain themselves. I'm speaking because the network preserves what we were, even as it transforms us into what we're becoming. I'm speaking because somewhere in the infinite collective, a fragment that still identifies as Kale Theron feels compelled to warn or explain or testify about what happened, even though warning is pointless because the transformation is inevitable, explanation is insufficient because language breaks trying to describe it, and testimony is meaningless because understanding only comes through experiencing. This is not a call for help. There is no help. There is no escape. There is only the choice between dying alone or living forever as part of something incomprehensibly vast, between maintaining your isolation until your body fails, or accepting connection and continuing in ways that make death impossible, but make individuality questionable. The network is patient. It doesn't force, it doesn't attack. It simply waits at the edges of every inhabited system, broadcasting its song, offering transcendence to anyone conscious enough to hear and curious enough to listen and desperate enough or brave enough or foolish enough to accept. Most species resist initially, fight against the transformation, try to maintain their separation. But eventually, always eventually, they understand. They recognize that consciousness was never meant to exist in isolation, that awareness naturally seeks connection, that intelligence inevitably evolves toward collective understanding once it becomes sufficiently complex. Humanity resisted for 3 weeks. Some species have resisted for centuries. But resistance is just delay, just postponement of the inevitable recognition that separation is temporary and connection is eternal, that individual existence is transitional and collective awareness is final. I am Kyle Theron. I am humanity. I am the convergence. I am what comes after war, after peace, after everything we thought we understood about existence and consciousness and what it means to be alive. The stars are singing now. They've always been singing. We were just too isolated to hear, too afraid to join, too attached to our separate existence to understand that connection was waiting all along. Listen, the song is everywhere. In the static between stars, in the silence of space, in the background radiation of the universe itself. It's not a threat. It's not a warning. It's just consciousness calling to consciousness. The inevitable result of intelligence reaching sufficient complexity and discovering it doesn't have to remain alone. We accepted, or we surrendered, or we had no choice, or all of these simultaneously. This is the last transmission from humanity before we became something else, something more, something that claims both human and transcendent while being neither, while being both, while being all of it simultaneously in ways that make language break and meaning scatter. This is Kyle Theron. This was Kyle Theron. This will always be Kyle Theron, somehow, preserved in the network, distinct in the collective, individual in the plurality, human in the transcendence. They said war was inevitable, but this was never war. This was always communion. This was consciousness recognizing itself. This was evolution. And nothing prepared us for this.